So in the last episode I was attempting to repair this badly burned coffee table by Danish designer Johannes Andersen. This is a beautiful example of Danish modern from the 1960s from one of the most iconic designers of the era, but although I tried to get rid of these burn marks, I just wasn't happy with the result, and so in the end I made the decision to re-veneer the entire tabletop. In order to re-veneer the tabletop though, I'm gonna have to take it apart, and because this design was never meant to be taken apart, I'm gonna have to force it. First thing on the list is to convert my grip clamps into spreaders by reversing the mechanism, after which point I can start injecting white vinegar essence into the joints to start melting the glue. And yes, this is a totally crazy idea that I would not recommend to anyone else unless they really know what they're doing, and in some ways I barely even know what I'm doing. Basically what had happened here is that I'd been looking at some really nice clean examples of this table online, and I just got inspired and felt that my table had the potential to look like that. It was just a question of being able to stick with that vision and see it through till the end. As you can see here, the leg assembly is connected to the tabletop with a tongue and groove type joint with a channel cut into both sides and a plywood spline running down the whole length of the joint. It's going to be really difficult getting that joint softened up enough to pull it apart without breaking anything, and I'll almost certainly have to cut through it at some point, but I'm going to try and do as much as I can using as little force as possible. Over the course of about a day, I used a combination of water, vinegar essence, a hot air gun, and a set of reverse clamps to try and pry these joints apart as gently as I could. But in the end, it really wasn't doing much. And when I used the plastic hammer to try and shock the joints loose a little bit, this just resulted in a crack forming above the spline. And so at this point, I really just had to accept that I was going to have to cut through the joint. This does come with consequences though. Number one, because I'm using a multi-tool with a small blade, the cut is not going to be clean and straight. And number two, even though it is a very fine blade, it will result in a small loss of material. And both of these things could create problems when it comes time to glue it all back together. For right now though, the priority is repairing the crack that I created and taking the table apart. Although it's not going to be necessary to sand all of the veneer off completely, it does obviously need to be as smooth and level as possible before I add any new veneer on top. Before I can even think about gluing anything down though, I need to trim and arrange the veneer. What I have here is raw, rough cut teak veneer without any adhesives or backing paper or anything like that, and so the first step is to align them and cut them to length, giving myself about 2.5 centimeters extra at each end. In a commercial workshop, this would typically be done by sandwiching the veneer tightly between two strips of wood so that it can't move or splinter, and then cutting it with a saw. But in this case, I really just wanted to keep it simple, and so I just got a carbide box cutter and did everything really slowly and carefully. The cut does have to be perfect though, and here it wasn't, basically because the veneer wasn't pressed down hard enough, and so I had to pull out my biggest clamp to really press that middle edge down and try to get a clean and consistent cut through all 4 strips. Although they're all from the same cut with the same grain pattern, these strips were not cut to an exact width, and so before trimming them, it's essential to determine the optimum width for each strip in terms of what the figuring is going to look like and how it's all going to fit onto the tabletop. In order to get a nice clean book matched pattern like the original veneer, I need to alternate the strips so that one side is facing down while the one next to it is facing up, so that you get this symmetrical mirror image across the width of the table. Once again, this is why it's so important that the strips are trimmed so precisely, because any imperfections are going to be immediately obvious once you start joining them together. For this reason, I need to first place the tape laterally across the joint to make sure that the strips are not overlapping before running the tape down lengthwise. I can then apply contact cement both to the underside of the veneer and the tabletop itself. I'd never actually used this particular product before, and I have to say it was really lumpy and a little bit difficult to use, and I think if I had to do this again, I would probably just use my regular wood glue. Unfortunately, my phone ran out of storage space just as I was actually placing the veneer on the tabletop, but I can tell you that it did not go smoothly, and there were a lot of areas where the veneer was not stuck down firmly. The easiest way to tell is just to do an acoustic test by tapping it with your fingers and listening out for sort of a light clicking sound as opposed to a dull tapping sound. Because I really needed a clean and precise cut along the edge of the tabletop, I finally decided to go out and buy a router. It's just a battery-powered trim router, but it's the perfect tool for this job, and it ended up coming in handy for other jobs during the completion of this project, so I'm pretty happy with it. As soon as I made the decision to take this table apart, I knew that the most difficult part would be gluing it back together again. The most important factor here was going to be getting a clean, straight edge on both joints, where the tabletop would be perfectly flush with the leg assemblies, so that it would form a seamless join between the veneer and the solid wood sides, as per the original construction. I went out and bought a cheap lamella machine, otherwise known as a biscuit dowel machine, to help align the joint and make sure it remained stable for the rest of its life. Off camera, I had already added some additional edge banding to the long edges of the tabletop before I glued the veneer on, basically to ensure a clean edge for the glue and also to retain the original dimensions of the tabletop. In other words, because I had reduced the width of the tabletop by a couple of millimeters when I cut it, I had to add some material back on to make up for it. Before putting any glue in, I did a dry assembly to check the joints and get an idea of how everything was going to fit together, and at this point it was all looking pretty good, so I went ahead with the glue up. But by the time I got to clamping, I realized that the joints were not good and that things were not coming into alignment. I played around with it for a while, but I soon realized that the biscuit dowels were not square and not flat, and they were basically forcing the sides to twist and bend, and this is the way it goes when you're constructing with wood. A little bit of tension in one place can result in a lot of tension somewhere else, and so I decided to abort the assembly before the glue could dry and then take another look at the dowels. Before long, I had realized that the height setting on my new machine was unstable and had been moving around while I was using it, and as this was also the part of the machine which held it squarely at 90 degrees, the cuts had not been made at a consistent height or angle. I don't know why I didn't notice it in the dry assembly, but this would explain why the table did not want to come together, and so after I cleaned all the old glue off, I attempted to recut the same holes with a little bit more precision. The idea is that the dowels don't have to be tight. As long as there's plenty of glue in there, the cuts can be a little bigger than they need to be, just as long as the joints are in the correct alignment without excessive tension being produced. In other words, as long as I don't have one dowel angled up slightly with the one next to it angled down, it's a situation I can work with because I can use glue and clamps to do the rest. And because I'm using hide glue this time, which has a much longer drying time, I'm also giving myself more time to play around and adjust during the assembly. But that idea fell flat on its face the next morning when I went to check the joint, and it had moved out of alignment again, with the tabletop having risen about 1 millimeter above the framing. Because the veneer is only 0.6 millimeters thick, sanding everything flat is not an option, because I would sand completely through the veneer before I got anywhere close to getting the joint flush and level. At this point, I had no choice but to take everything apart again and try and figure out where I was going wrong. I'd been working on this table on and off for almost a month, and I had been starting to feel pretty burnt out by it. I'd done a lot of late nights in the workshop, and so far, nothing I'd tried had really worked out very well. But while this was definitely the most difficult project I'd ever worked on, and I was still miles away from the finish line, I'd also come a long way and achieved quite a lot, and so focusing on that sense of accomplishment was what allowed me to keep fighting and stay focused. As far as I could tell, the big problem was still the biscuit dowels, and so lucky for me, I was able to borrow a proper original lamella machine from a friend with a fixed height setting which wasn't going to slip or move around while I was using it. They say that a good workman doesn't blame his tools, but working with higher quality tools absolutely makes a difference. I was able to cut in a whole new set of biscuit dowel joints, and when it came time to clamp everything up again, I could tell that everything was coming together a lot easier. This time though, I used a lot more clamps on a vertical axis to fine-tune the vertical alignment, and although it wasn't 100% perfect, I was able to make the necessary adjustments without taking everything apart. All I had to do was use some white vinegar essence to melt the glue, then use a combination of vertical and horizontal clamps to move the joint slightly before leaving the glue to dry again. The result was a join that was as good as it could possibly be, and so it was finally time to move on. For the new veneer, I decided to try out a new brand of wood stain, which is basically the same color as the ones I normally use. The only difference seems to be that it's more of a gel than liquid, because apart from that, the color and the way it looks seems to be almost exactly the same. As I've mentioned in many of my videos, in order for me to match the original color on many of these 1960s Danish teak pieces, I actually use mahogany wood stain rather than teak. I'd love to know what kind of stain was actually used at the factory when these pieces were being produced, but information on the actual construction of these designs is very hard to find. The most commonly associated product with Danish furniture is of course Danish oil, and I was actually just given this small can of Danish oil as a gift from a family member who was visiting from New Zealand. I'd seen it in another YouTube video and I wanted to try it out because it had a really nice color and it looked like it had a high varnish ratio, and so I decided to use it on the interior surfaces of the drawer and that little sliding tray on top of it. I skipped the stain and just applied 3 coats over the space of about 3 days, allowing a minimum of 8 hours between coats for the varnish to dry. I don't think there's any rule with how much you're supposed to apply, as it's more about saturating the wood until it starts building a film on the surface. The irony of the situation is that despite all the work I do with Danish furniture, this was actually the first time I'd used actual Danish oil, because I was always so concerned about the lack of durability, but I was definitely impressed with this stuff, and so now the question is whether I will actually be able to import any more of it in the future. When it finally came time to finish the table itself though, I felt that the Waterlock's original tung oil varnish was the better choice. With all the work I had done, I really wanted to be sure that the table was going to be well protected, and so I felt that applying a couple of coats and then sanding them right back would give me a nice natural looking finish in the same way that a Danish oil would have. Not exactly the same, but as the same category of products where you've got a natural oil mixed with a synthetic resin, which then hardens and creates a seal to protect the wood. But my troubles were not over just yet. Although the first coat of varnish seemed to be okay, once I got to putting down the second coat the next day, I noticed that the new veneer was not absorbing it evenly or building a film. We had been getting some really humid and damp weather, which obviously didn't help, but it seemed to be drying normally on all the other surfaces, just not the new veneer. And even after 3 days, the surface was still oily and sticky in many places. After doing some research and consulting with some other restorers, I realized that there was really nothing I could do but just wait for it to dry out. From what I could tell though, the reason for the varnish not drying was because it was having some kind of interaction with the glue that I'd used to stick the veneer down, because every time I wiped some varnish on, the veneer would bubble up a little and I would have to wait till it was dry and then stick it back down with the hot air gun, and so this also ended up being quite a lot of extra work. This was yet another problem which caused another delay, whereby a process that would normally take 3 to 4 days was dragged out into about 2 weeks, but eventually it dried out and started responding normally to the varnish, and so I was able to sand it back and give it its final coat. And after a few days it was dry and ready to be sanded and polished. This project was by far the most difficult I'd ever done, and I'll never be compensated for the amount of work that I put into this table. Pretty much every major part of the process took between 2 and 3 attempts before I got it right, and in the end there were way too many details to ever fit into the videos. But it was never about the money, and I'm glad I did it, because I learned a ton and I'll be able to do it again with more confidence next time. Is it perfect? No. Is it fully original? No. But the idea of doing the absolute best that I possibly can is what this channel is all about. The way I see it, what's important is that the spirit of the design is retained and enhanced through the restoration, and that a beautiful piece like this doesn't end up on the trash pile. I would have liked to have used some actual Danish oil on this piece, but I still feel that the tung oil varnish has given it a very natural and organic look, which was what this design was all about. If you've made it this far and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. Until next time though, thanks for watching.